I'm G4, and you're listening to the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading, for now, the exuberantly opinionated atlas of the basic techniques for the world's greatest hobby. This is BGT Episode 25, Mid-Atlantic Class 2s. In this episode, I'll continue my history of railroading in the Mid-Atlantic region. Wow, we have had quite an adventurous year with the Borealis, the Tom Barbalet interview, my unexpected just in the nick of too late take on congestion pricing in New York City, and of course the collapse of the empire of my birth, if not the end of civilization as we know it. With all the complexification of my upcoming fleeing as a refugee to a foreign country, I don't know how much model train stuff I'll be able to keep up with, because my layout will likely be packed up, moved, and possibly dormant for a few years while I re-establish a new life elsewhere. As such, I don't know how much of regular PFP will be able to pertain to trains as I originally intended it, not that I've been doing a good job of keeping that up, and it may just be that I'll have to busy myself with urbanism for a few years, because going on a bicycle ride doesn't require layout space, so I'll try to fill in a bit more BGT than I have been of late to rebalance the scales towards, scale modeling. Thus, enjoy this month's episode returning to the miniseries, Mid-Atlantic Class 2 Railroads. Full disclosure, in the case I haven't made this clear enough before, the humongous scope of these railroad history episodes means I'm relying far much more than I'd like on Wikipedia articles, although I will note supplemented here and there with Railroad History Society websites, independent research, and my own gross knowledge. So, importantly, if there is ever any specific thing that piques your interest, please follow up on it, fact-checking for yourself later with your own sleuthing. Otherwise, on with the show. Compared to the Class 1s of the Lehigh Valley or Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, but a notably much shorter railroad running through the Poconos and eventually Catskills was the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railroad, NYS&W, or more amusingly, the Susie Q. While officially classified as a Class 1, after doing this series for a minute, I feel that, for modeling purposes, it fits better here as a regional. The Susie Q's first physical iteration was the New Jersey Western Railroad, which in 1867 started as yet another railroad to build west from the Jersey side of the Hudson to the Pennsylvania coal country and eventually a Lake Erie port. An early alliance was sought with a railroad out of Oswego, the New York and Oswego Midland, with the intent of connecting them end to end, and they did run through trains via a third intermediate railroad for a few years, but the Panic of 1873 terminated this arrangement. By this time, the New Jersey Western, now the New Jersey Midland, had grown on its own to Hackensack and Hanford at the New Jersey border. Now, the loss of the Oswego arrangement having led to a crisis of identity, it instead looked to the coalfields of Pennsylvania. To do this, the NJM consolidated with 5 other railroads in the North Jersey area in 1881 to form the New York, Susquehanna, and Western, and set about extending westward to East Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. There, the Susie Q survived a few years connecting with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, but after a decade this too grew stale. By 1894, it chartered and leased a subsidiary railroad, the Wilkes-Barre and Eastern, completing a route to the Wyoming Valley as one of the last railroads to enter the northern anthracite field. Nothing much seems to have happened to the Susie Q for a while, but for that it was the first Class 1 railroad to fully dieselize in June 1945, and its only notable passenger trains were a few small commuter services in New Jersey, no name trains of note to survive through the pages of history. As with many northeastern railroads, the tripartite decline of northeastern manufacturing, post-war population, and anthracite-based home heating didn't do it kindly, but a particularly hard blow was dealt with the abandonment of the connecting Lehigh and New England in 1961, which ablated much bridge anthracite traffic back to New York. As a result, the Susie Q sold off its nearly new passenger equipment, replacing it with second-hand coaches, and soon thereafter ended commuter operations in 1966. Branch lines were jettisoned, and even the main line to Pennsylvania looked less and less important now that coal was no longer in the picture. The railroad was not in a good state. Though it avoided bailout by Conrail, bankruptcy was declared in 1976. Rather than see another asset get abandoned, the state of New Jersey asked a short-line conglomerate, Delaware Otsego Corporation, or DO, known for rehabilitating several other branch lines and short lines to functionality and even profitability in New York State, to intervene and take over the 43-mile shadow of the former Suzy Q almost entirely in New Jersey. The deal was officiated in 1980. Much like the Suzy Q, the DO Suzy Q chugged along without much incident for quite a while without much note until 2005, when now majority co-owner Norfolk Southern expressed interest in divesting the former Erie Railroad's main line from Port Jervis to Binghamton. The Suzy Q hopped on the opportunity and leased the whole line, giving itself a major mountain-spanning main line for the first time in 30 years, this time much more akin to the original route planned all the way back in the 1860s. Nowadays, the Suzy Q is a major powerhouse in short-line traffic in the region and hosts Metro-North commuter trains from Port Jervis Station to Suffern, with services bound for Hoboken, New Jersey, and transfers to Manhattan and beyond. While a quiet railroad, it's fitting that it had great plans, grew, shrank, and grew again along a completely different route to finally achieve at least a portion of its original 160-year-old dream. The Reading Railroad, spelled the same as the Reading Railroad, was based in Philadelphia but grew out of its titular Pennsylvania city. It, too, was a regional, never leaving Pennsylvania but for a joint venture with the Pennsy in Jersey and a mere few thousands of meters into Delaware, but as far as eastern Pennsylvania went, it was an inescapable giant. As with many northeastern and mid-Atlantic railroads, a portion of the then Philadelphia and Reading opened in 1838 along the banks of the low-grade and somewhat meandering Schuylkill River between Reading and Norristown, Pennsylvania, opening to Philadelphia in late 1839. Unlike much of its brethren, instead of connecting New York with the upper anthracite fields by Scranton, the P&R intended to connect Philly with the lower anthracite fields just north of Reading. At the time, it was a fully double-tracked, horse-drawn system providing a faster and year-round lowland extension of the Schuylkill River Canal. Very soon, the P&R sought to push deeper into the mountains with its own tracks to the coal mines. In 1842, tracks further along the Schuylkill to Pottsville and Mount Carbon opened, bypassing the canal and extending to several coal mines and short lines. To complement this, on the other end of the railroad, a port was opened on the Delaware River in Philadelphia to offload excess coal for export. The operation was an immediate success. Taking an aside for a moment to discuss its ensuing corporate history, the profit from the coal line haul begat the subsidiary Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, and resulted in one of the most vertically integrated monopolies in all of railroading or even the entire corporate world. Everything from the coal mines and their miners, then the railroads and their trainmen, to the steel mills and their foundrymen were all owned by one unified corporate banner, separated by just a few paper walls. Not only did this allow for a controlled market, it made for a controlling region. In many places, the Reading was the only provider of mining employment, transportation, both human and material, and smelting. If you lived anywhere between Philadelphia and Williamsport, Shippensburg to Allentown, in many cases, the Reading was the company that dictated your entire life. By 1871, the railroad was the largest company in the world, and earned the highest award known to business, a spot on the Monopoly Board. Expansion continued at a quick clip, now looking over state borders. In 1879, it acquired 2 lines north of Philly, one to Bethlehem and another all the way to Trenton, Newark, and Jersey City across the Hudson from New York. In 1885, the Reading acquired the Philadelphia and Atlantic City Railway to shore up suburban transit, provide commuters with a weekend getaway, and open a new saltwater freight port, although the last goal didn't amount to much. And to match all this expansion, the Reading opened in 1893 the fantastic Reading Terminal for its passenger trains and new company headquarters in the heart of Center City, Philadelphia. That same year, the Reading leased the Central Railroad of New Jersey, or CNJ, eventually acquiring a majority of the stock in 1901, giving it access to many new lines in central and southern New Jersey and northeastern Pennsylvania, effectively operating it all as one system even though the two remain separate corporate entities. But all of this growth came at a cost, and the Panic of 1893 sent creditors knocking. Attempted takeovers of the Central New England and Boston and Maine railroads were aborted, and the Reading was never able to recover its ambitions at becoming a true Class I, instead doubling down on its home territory and never really straying far from Pennsylvania or New Jersey. In 1906, the Roosevelt administration's trust-busting activity forced a split between the railroad and its coal and iron businesses, hobbling its corporate might, although they did continue to operate very closely for the rest of their days. To face this new post-monopoly, post-expansion world, the Reading started to invest in what became known as its cross line, connecting a bunch of formerly independent lines that radiated out from Philadelphia into a radial southwest to northeast trunk line which ran across its entire network. hence Crossline. Working in cooperation with several other railroads, primarily the Lehigh Valley and C&J to the east and the Western Maryland to the west, the Reading could use its Crossline to now quickly deliver freight to or from the northeast via its route from Jersey City to Easton, Bethlehem, Reading, Lebanon, Harrisburg, and Shippensburg, bypassing congestion points on both its own system and other railroads. These cooperative agreements would eventually become branded as the Alphabet Routes Alpha Jet Freight Services, mentioned in a previous railroad history episode. Given its traffic density and unusual profitability, the Reading punched far above its weight technologically and engaged in many modernization efforts throughout the 1920s to 40s, including quadruple tracking, advanced signaling, electrification of commuter lines and new passenger equipment, and bypass route constructions. To match this new image, and somewhat behind-the-scenes corporate wheeling and dealing, in 1924, the Reading finally changed its name from the Philadelphia and Reading to its simpler, abbreviated nickname, the Reading Company. The Reading shops north of its namesake city allowed for not just heavy maintenance and rebuilding, but full-on design and construction of in-house locomotives, although most of its steam locomotives were built by the Philadelphia-based Baldwin. Due to its sub-regional scope, the Reading's passenger trains weren't exceptionally well known save for the streamlined Silver and Blue Crusader, which ran between Philadelphia and New York in partnership with the C&J. Other trains included King Coal between Philly and Shamokin, the Main Line between Philly and Pottsville, giving rise to the name of the modern suburban neighborhood, the North Penn between Philly and Bethlehem, the Harrisburg Special and Queen of the Valley between Jersey City and Harrisburg, and the Interstate Express between Philly and Syracuse via Scranton, run along with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western. It also ran extremely robust commuter service out of Reading Terminal around the Philly region. As with many other northeastern regionals, the overbuilt, low-traffic branch line routes and loss of post office mail contracts in the 1960s hit passenger trains hard, in addition to the traditional problems of automobility and suburban sprawl, and most routes were converted to short, self-propelled rail diesel cars, then eventually abandoned in the 1970s, with the notable exception of its commuter lines. But despite these and other cost-cutting and right-sizing measures such as the Cross Line, bankruptcy was declared in 1971. The story of many other railroads in this region, the Reading was bailed out by the federal government into Conrail in 1976, with its commuter operations being taken over by the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. Notably, in the 1980s, SEPTA decided to do something unique. Patterned off of Germany's Schnellbahn, or S-Bahn-style regional rail operations, they decided to connect the Penzie's commuter stub-end terminal, suburban station, with the Reading's stub-ended Reading terminal, via a short 3-kilometer tunnel such that the Penzie's commuter trains could through-run back out as the Reading's commuter trains and vice versa. Unfortunately, this plan meant that the Reading terminal was replaced with a new underground station, currently named Jefferson Station, opening in 1984, and leaving the formerly grand Reading terminal to be converted into a much less grand convention center. Although one iconic element, the street-level Reading Terminal Market, does survive as one of the most visited tourist attractions in the city. Also, quixotically, SEPTA was never able to fully realize the Center City commuter connection's transformative capacity due to nation-leading mismanagement, and still runs most lines off-peak hourly at best, having too many crew members and low platforms throughout the network, with some scathingly backronymming SEPTA to the Society for the Elimination of Passenger Trains in America. As it stands, the most identifiable remains of the Reading, besides the tracks it laid and a few steam locomotives, are the Farmers Market Knee train station in Center City and a space on a board game. Quite closely related to the Reading, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, or C&J, originated in 1836 as a small horse-car line emanating from Elizabethport, New Jersey. By 1849, it had upgraded to steam and started pushing westward into the anthracite fields, as was the trend of the day. By 1852, it had traversed the state to Phillipsburg. In 1864, it completed an extension to Jersey City and had started acquiring branch lines along the route. Very shortly afterwards, in 1866, it acquired the Lehigh Coal and Navigation Company, a medium-small but early adopter railroad which initially started as a canal competitor, then proceeded to eclipse the canal all the way from Easton to Wilkes-Barre. Many an anthracite mine was served by the line, and it slowly pushed deeper into the Wyoming Valley, reaching Scranton by 1888. The C&J also started extending southward across New Jersey, acquiring in 1879 the New Jersey Southern, which, creatively enough, extended along the exact middle and southern leg of the state from Port Monmouth to Bridgeton. One of the most famous associations with the C&J was in Mauch Chunk, Pennsylvania, a town with a Native American name, which itself was actually renamed later as Jim Thorpe, a famed Native American athlete who grew up in the area. In Jim Thorpe was the Mauch Chunk Switchback Railway, operating not far from the beautiful C&J depot, regarded as the first roller coaster on planet Earth. Originally starting as a simple inclined plane, think early angled elevator, to a coal mine in 1827, then drifting coal cars down a gentle grade as only the second gravity railroad in the United States, the late 1840s saw it modernized into a tourist attraction with Barney car inclined propelled passenger cars and anti-rollback mechanisms. Inflation adjusted, a ticket cost well over $100, not at all including the incredible expense of getting there, and many prominent luminaries of the time made their pilgrimage to Mauch Chunk, not the least of which being Samuel Clemens, aka Mark Twain, President and anti-conservative war hero Ulysses S. Grant, William Astor, and Thomas Edison. In 1874, the CNJ purchased the Switchback Railroad and leased it to local businessmen. Unfortunately, being a luxury, it quickly succumbed to the Great Depression and ceased operations in 1932, but the right-of-way is now on the National Register of Historic Places and is a local recreational bicycle trail. Back to the CNJ, in 1901, the Reading Railroad formalized its control. In 1929, partially as a result of this agreement, the CNJ inaugurated one of the most famous named trains in railroading, the Blue Comet, between Jersey City and Atlantic City. Advertised as a fully deluxe service and painted in a distinctive royal blue from pilot to parlor, it ran for only about 20 years before suffering an early death due to automobiles. Luxury trains through non-scenic regions were somewhat more prone to this, given that they were expensive to operate and rich people also were the first demographic to buy four-wheeled homicide machines, but its incredible advertising campaign has allowed the name to long outlive its operation. In many ways, the Comet preempted the eventual trend of streamlining and standardizing passenger comfort. Other notable passenger trains included the Crusader between Jersey City and Philadelphia, operated with the Reading Railroad, the Bullet between Wilkes-Barre and Jersey City, the Interstate Express between Syracuse and Philadelphia, operated with the Delaware, Lackawanna, and Western, the Williamsporter between Jersey City and Williamsport, Pennsylvania, and the Mermaid between Scranton and Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Additionally, the CNJ partnered with the Baltimore and Ohio for access to New Jersey and New York for the National Limited to St. Louis and the Capital Limited to Chicago. As with many anthracite railroads, nothing much seems to have happened through the early part of the 20th century with declining mining in the upper anthracite fields. When the Lehigh in New England was abandoned, the CNJ acquired a few lines and operated them as branches. In 1965, so much anthracite traffic had withered that the CNJ entered into a cooperative agreement with the Lehigh Valley Railroad to consolidate their main lines to Scranton rather than have two duplicative routes. In 1972, all CNJ operations ended in Pennsylvania, and in 1976 it was absorbed into Conrail. Another important partner with the Reading's history was the Penn-Reading Seashore Lines. Obviously, the Jersey Shore has long been a popular vacation destination, back in the day for both rich and poor alike, and the Reading, the monopolist of eastern Pennsylvania, decided to exploit that. Two railroads ran from Philly to Atlantic City, the West Jersey and Seashore and the Atlantic City Railroad. The former was owned by the Pennsylvania, and the latter the Reading. As with most other things in the southeastern Pennsylvania market, they competed furiously, posting faster schedules, better fares, and sometimes even literally racing trains down adjacent tracks. The West Jersey and Seashore came from when, in 1896, the Pennsylvania Railroad decided to consolidate all of its southern New Jersey lines into one banner. It operated mostly from Camden, New Jersey, across the Delaware from Philadelphia to Atlantic City, but had many branches, some commuter, some regional. Notably, it was third rail electrified. The Atlantic City Railroad was the Reading's own consolidation of southern New Jersey lines in 1889, and also had a branch from the Delaware River across from Philly to Atlantic City, with many branches, some local commuter lines, and others reaching as far as Cape May, the southernmost point of New Jersey. In 1926, the Benjamin Franklin Bridge opened, allowing vehicular crossing of the Delaware River and overland travel to Atlantic City. This massively cut into profits for both the WJNS and the AC, significantly earlier than for other railroads. As such, in 1931, the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities ordered the two railroads merged to stem losses. With this, most of southern New Jersey was now under the control of a single railroad, owned 2/3 by the Pennsy and 1/3 by the Reading. The two parent railroads operated the Penn-Reading Seashore Lines cooperatively, pooling resources. As a result, the PRSL owned remarkably little of its own equipment, only 24 locomotives predating the merger. As the parent railroads dieselized, the PRSL became the downstream repository of unwanted steam locomotives, thereby earning a certain charm among East Coasters. However, in the 1950s, it started to acquire its own fleet of diesels to have a reliable source of power. As the 1960s wore on, the continued entrenchment of auto dependency and freeway follies certainly didn't help, but even worse, the jet age meant that people fled Atlantic City for more exotic destinations. For a while, the Atlantic City line was reduced to a puny RDC stage, departing the end of the Patco high-speed line for Atlantic City. Eventually, the PRSL folded into Conrail in 1976, and the Atlantic City line survives today as a New Jersey Transit regional rail line. Heading back up into the mountains, and in stark contrast to many of the other anthracite roads, is the New York, Ontario, and Western, one of the shortest Class 2s yet. The NY-O&W, commonly referred to as the O&W, or in later years, the Old and Weary, began life as the New York and Oswego Midland. Unlike most of the other railroads of its ilk, this time it was charted out of Oswego, at the corner of Lake Ontario, and started building backwards to NYC in 1868. Progress was slow, and brief arrangements were made for trackage rights into New York City. In 1880, the name changed to the O&W, the line was extended to the Hudson River, and a new set of trackage rights was obtained from the New York West Shore and Buffalo. In the late 1880s, it acquired 4 branches in upstate, but the biggest being an 1890 extension southwest to Scranton, allowing it to cash in on the anthracite craze. An unfortunate happenstance, the O&W never finished its main line to New York City itself, only ever reaching as far as the Hudson River in Kingston and Cornwall, relying on fickle trackage rights the rest of the way. This left it with a very poor routing, from a very small port town on the Ontario to 2 even smaller port towns on the Hudson, but with a massive mountain-crossing Catskill route in the middle, going from nowhere to nowhere via Oof. It did serve many resorts through the Catskill Mountains, but increasing automobility in the 1940s also sent that spiraling. Bankruptcy was declared extraordinarily early in 1948, when other railroads were still at their post-war streamliner heyday. After a long and contentious bankruptcy filing with disagreements between the O&W, other potentially purchasing railroads, and local municipalities, the court finally settled with a verdict in 1957. Liquidation. This was the first ever mainline abandonment in railroad history. Every bridge, every rail was removed by 1959, all assets were auctioned, some were bought, most were scrapped. Some other railroads took over convenient track segments, but on the whole, the New York, Ontario, and Western was wiped clean off the face of the earth. Railroad historian George Drury later commented that the O&W had always been sickly and should never have been built at just 541 miles. The Northern Central Railway is a very different type of railroad. Despite being a Class 1, its name is almost lost to history. It started way back in 1828 as the Baltimore and Susquehanna Railroad, intent on emulating the success of the Baltimore and Ohio, but northeasterly to the mouth of the Susquehanna, then due north into Pennsylvania and along its banks. The Pennsylvania General Assembly did not much like this, as it was turning Baltimore into the country's railroad capital instead of Philadelphia, stymieing local progress. Construction began in 1829 and reached Cockeysville, Maryland in 1831. One of the first American-built locomotives, the Herald, was purchased in 1832. Trying to find a way into Pennsylvania, it amended its charter and instead started building northwestward to Westminster and Owings Mills, Maryland. Despite the opposition in Pennsylvania, the York and Maryland Railway was eventually chartered in 1832 to connect with it in Gettysburg. The two companies' lines from Baltimore to York, Pennsylvania was completed in 1838, offering a much more direct route than the Maryland and Pennsylvania, and including the Howard Tunnel, not quite the earliest railroad tunnel, but the earliest still in active service today. In 1840, through the construction of the Wrightsville, York, and Gettysburg Railroad, rail crossed the Susquehanna on the Wrightsville to Columbia Bridge, and trackage rights over the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, later the Pennsylvania, finally got a route to Harrisburg. Capitalizing on the full route, a new Italianate passenger station was built in Baltimore in 1850, converting the previous station into a freight depot, and the 1850s saw a flurry of small railroads opening up along the line, such as the Cumberland Valley, Hanover Branch, York and Cumberland, and Baltimore, Carroll, and Frederick Railroads, the latter of which would eventually become the Western Maryland. Most notably, in 1851, an additional company, the Susquehanna Railroad, was chartered to continue building up the Susquehanna from Harrisburg to Sunbury, then splitting up each branch of the river to Williamsport and Wilkes-Barre. The Susquehanna Railroad immediately wove itself into the fabric of the local railroad empire with a $500,000 loan from the York and Cumberland and Wrightsville, York, and Gettysburg Railroads, as well as the city of Baltimore itself. However, a series of financial troubles, high-profile crashes, and right-of-way legal disputes led both the states of Maryland and Pennsylvania to recharter the whole shebang, merging the Baltimore and Susquehanna, York and Maryland, York and Cumberland, and Susquehanna Railroads into one company, forming in 1854 the Northern Central Railway. Notably, the York and Cumberland gave the Northern Central an alternate route into Mechanicsburg and Harrisburg, independently of the crossing of the Susquehanna on the Wrightsville, York, and Gettysburg, and trackage rights on the Philadelphia and Columbia. With the merger completed and presumably better financial footing found, construction on the Susquehanna extension resumed in earnest, opening up numerous reserves of timber and coal which had previously been accessible only by canal during the summer months. In 1858, the line reached its initial goal of Sunbury, sprouting connecting short lines like daisies as it went. Most amusingly, for a short while, until a bridge could be built, there was briefly a connection across the Susquehanna made by canal boat. A train would arrive on one side, people would detrain and board a canal boat, cross the river, and then pick up a train on the other side. In 1861, however, the now Pennsylvania Railroad acquired a controlling interest in the Northern Central as a means to compete with the B&O for Baltimore-bound traffic. And, though allowed to operate separately, the Northern Central was effectively a part of the Pennsylvania Empire for over 110 years. But the Northern Central's tales don't end here. Almost immediately, it endured one of the most famous and harrowing acts of subterfuge in railroad history. It is early 1861, and President-elect Abraham Lincoln is set to take office as the country tears itself apart over a civil war between the abolitionist North and the frothing-at-the-mouth racist rural chucklefucks of the South. Due to the customs of the time, the president was not allowed to campaign on his own behalf, instead ceding the ground to endorsers and surrogates throughout the nation. So, mind you, the South was seceding, not actually having heard any of his stated policy positions. In preparing to take office, President-elect Lincoln set about on a whistle-stop tour from Illinois to Washington City, reaching Philadelphia in early February. However, to get to the capital, he would have to pass through Maryland and Baltimore, the northernmost slaveholding state and a city rife with recent ferment and pro-conservative action. Just before Lincoln's departure for Washington City, the Pinkerton Detectives, an agency of increasingly dubious record as time went on, nevertheless managed to uncover a plot to assassinate Lincoln as he passed through Baltimore. To combat this, Allen Pinkerton devised a scheme to secretly smuggle Lincoln and his bodyguard Ward Lamon into Washington. The trip was decided to go along the Pennsy from Philadelphia to Harrisburg, down the Northern Central from Harrisburg to Baltimore, and over the B&O from Baltimore to Washington City. On Lincoln's last afternoon in Philadelphia, he, Lamon, and Pinkerton secretly stealed away from a dinner with Pennsylvania's Governor Andrew Curtin to the railroad station, disguising Lincoln in a shawl to obscure his unique features. Using a series of agents placed along the line, Pinkerton first deployed a decoy, announcing much chatter of a special package departing for D.C. a half-dozen hours later. In reality, the package was filled with old and useless railroad paperwork. He then had another agent, Kate Warren, secure the rearmost sleeping berths of the next train to Harrisburg, and had her hold the train briefly until Lincoln could arrive to an empty station and not be seen boarding. Upon arriving in Harrisburg, to get Lincoln out of the busy station, they hired a cabbie to drive around town for a few hours until the Northern Central train departed. With the help of another Pinkerton agent, George Franciscus, who just happened to be the superintendent of the Pennsylvania Railroad, a private special was chartered from Harrisburg to Baltimore. Just after they left, another agent climbed a telephone pole and snipped the telegraph wires. The two-car special sped south to Baltimore non-stop, with the entire main line having been cleared in advance for its progress. It arrived in Baltimore at 03:30, and the passenger cars were slowly and quietly hauled across town in the dead of night by horse on streetcar tracks from the Northern Central Station to the B&O, whereby it waited for just a hair longer than it should have, sending Pinkerton into a tizzy and departing just barely before sunrise, arriving in Washington City at 0600. This is genuinely a fascinating story that I'm astonished no one has made a movie of yet. Incredibly, one of the exact locomotives involved in this espionage survives to this day in the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum. This is just the beginning of the Northern Central during the War of Southern Racism. It was a major route connecting factories to the battlefront, carrying food, supplies, clothing, materiel, and troops. It was raided by Confederate Major General Jubal Early during the 1863 Gettysburg Campaign to be quickly repaired and evacuate Union soldiers wounded at Gettysburg itself. It was attacked again in 1864 and was the site of several skirmishes. In late 1863, Abraham Lincoln rode the NC again, this time to give the Gettysburg Address, changing trains at Hanover Junction, a station which still exists, and Lincoln rode a third and final time after his assassination on the famed Lincoln funeral train. Back to the railroad's history, for much of the time through the 1840s and 50s, the competing Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore had been building its way along the Chesapeake, connecting those three cities by 1866. While the route was much more direct, it was also much more rural, and the Northern Central seems to have still been the major road in the region because it passed through more cities en route to Baltimore, although the PW&B was still used by parent company Baltimore, Ohio for direct access to Philly. In 1881, the Pennsy decided to buy the PW&B from the B&O, giving it a more direct route and supplanting the B&O's infringement into its territory. As one may expect, this later became part of the Northeast Corridor, and very slowly, the Northern Central began to slide into obscurity. The NC was double-tracked to accommodate World War I traffic. It did have some online industries, albeit mostly pastoral in nature, and it even hosted commuter operations out of Baltimore for a while. However, another railroad, the Columbia and Port Deposit, was built up the Susquehanna in 1868, following the original route intended in the Northern Central's original charter, and the Pennsy purchased that in 1916 as an alternate route for war traffic. Favoring its more direct routing and easier grades, the Pennsy eventually diverted all through freight traffic to the Port Deposit branch, further eroding the importance of the Northern. The opening of Interstate I-83 in 1959 stole what few passengers there were left, ending local passenger service and forcing single tracking to again cut costs. A very few long-distance trains continued to operate over the original route through the 1960s and even into Amtrak, but that was it. Hurricane Agnes in 1972 dealt a final blow, causing many bridges to fail and washing out large segments of the line. Rail traffic ceased, and Penn Central abandoned the line south of York. However, all of the Northern Central was not quite yet lost. Presciently, PennDOT acquired and protected much of the route from York to the Maryland state line in 1973, immediately after its abandonment, preserving the right-of-way for future use. On the other end, a small segment out of Baltimore was rebuilt, redouble-tracked, and electrified in the 1980s to make the trunk of the Baltimore Light Rail, and still even saw nighttime freight service until 2005. The route from York to Harrisburg also still sees freight service. Through PennDOT's and MDOT's initiatives, most of the route south of York was converted into a long-distance rail trail for recreation and camping. And happily, in 2013, the Northern Central Railway reopened, operating a replica Civil War-era locomotive between New Freedom and Hanover Junction, sharing the history of one of America's earliest and most important railroads along a scenic journey through Pennsylvania's Piedmont. Another regional line of Civil War importance was the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. Also dating to the 1830s, the RF&P made solid progress, opening in 1837 from Richmond to Fredericksburg 100 kilometers away, and reaching the Potomac by 1842 with steamboat connections to Washington City 80 kilometers up the river. The Aquia Landing on the Potomac served a major role during the Civil War, with the United States Military Railroad operating segments of the RF&P directly to the front lines. As has been said of war, amateurs plan tactics, experts plan logistics. It took quite a while after the Civil War for the company to resuscitate its operations and finances, but it closed the gap to Washington with an extension to Quantico, Virginia in 1872. Several other railroads had attempted to bridge the Potomac south of Washington, and a string of companies had built the so-called Long Bridge over the river to Alexandria, connecting with the RF&P as it reached Quantico Landing. Over the next 50 years, the connection from Quantico to the district changed hands numerous times until falling under the control of a shell corporation of the Pennsylvania Railroad, finally being purchased outright by the RF&P in 1920. As part of these corporate shenanigans, the RF&P became owned by a joint agglomeration of the Pennsy, B&O, Chesapeake and Ohio, Atlantic Coastline, Seaboard Airline, and Southern Railways. Once it reached this point, the RF&P never much expanded between its 190-kilometer route between Washington City and Richmond, instead functioning much more as a regional alleyway between southern roads and the district. As such, the RF&P didn't have much of its own passenger service, only a few locals and the Old Dominion Parlor Limited between DC and Richmond. However, it was an absolute linchpin of East Coast railroading, hosting a litany of New York to Florida passenger trains, such as the East Coast Champion, Miamian, Havana Special, Palmetto Silver Star Comet and Meteor, Orange Blossom Special, Vacationer, Florida Special, Sunland, and Everglades. One tiny quirk of history, in 1977, the Washington Metropolitan Area Transportation Authority built a segment of the Blue Line Metro along Arlington Cemetery, reusing an old branch of the RF&P. This has been episode 25 of the Beginner's Guide to Model Railroading Mid-Atlantic Class 2s. The theme music is Spark of Life by Benjamin Lazarus through Tribe of Noise. I would like to thank my extremely generous and patient patrons, Pedro Reyes, Andrew LaVerghetta, Ron Kleiss, Bill Ford, Linda Eskin, and Roger Coleman. If you want to join our currently dead Facebook community, you can, but I gave up on social media because Meta is absolutely evil and helped to ruin the entire United States of America. Instead, if you have a question or comment, would like to make a donation, or would like to learn more, please visit the show's website at www.bgtmrring.org. That's Bravo Golf Tango, Michael Romeo Romeo, Indigo November Golf, Oscar Romeo Golf. If you like the show, please give me a good review on iTunes and subscribe to the podcast feed. If you really like the show, please consider becoming a patron, as it helps me defer the cost of equipment and website hosting. If you do not like the show, do not say anything and contemplate the thought crime that you have committed. That joke is so much more painfully poignant these days, but only for the very wrongest of reasons. This podcast was written, recorded, and produced on the ancestral lands of the Susquehannock, Lenni Lenape, Piscataway, Anacostan, Mohican, Munsee Lenape, Shakticoke, Quinnipiac, Paugussett, Wapinger, Hamonasets, Western and Eastern Nahantic, Pequot, Nahagansett, Wampanoag, Pokanoket, Massachusetts, Pawtucket, Naumkeag, Cayusi, Umatilla, Walla Walla, Duwamish, Squamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, Kauhlitahikan, Akokiska, Atacapa, Carrizo, Cheyenne, Ochethishikoing, Arapaho, Ute, and Lipan Apache tribes. I would like to thank them for their historical stewardship of central and southeastern Pennsylvania, eastern Maryland, New Jersey, southern New York, southern Connecticut, Rhode Island, southeastern Texas, western Washington, and central Colorado. This episode has been a while in the making, y'all. And now, as your reward for listening through my closing spiel, your modeler's vocabulary word for this episode is Pennsylvania. Cold. Thank you very much for listening, and happy modeling.